Alright, so today I want to talk about the essential of heating your enclosure for your snake. If you're just getting a snake, you're setting up your enclosure, you pretty much have two options as far as heat. You can either heat from above with a heat lamp, or you can heat from below with a heat mat. And I actually have two here. This is kind of your basic heat lamp from above. I actually use both of these, as a matter of fact, on different enclosures. There's pros and cons of each one, so I'm going to walk you through the pros and cons today. And this is essentially what a heat lamp looks like. There's different sizes. This one is a pretty big one. It heats from above. Essentially what it does is it either sits in a cutout on your enclosure, or sometimes it'll actually sit on the screen on top of your enclosure. There's different types of bulbs you can use, and this heats from above. And then the other option you have for heating is heating from below, and that is with a heat mat. And a heat mat essentially is just a really thin piece of plastic with a heating element inside of it, and you plug it in, this thing heats up, and you essentially what you do is you put it underneath your enclosure, and then you heat your enclosure from the bottom. And today I want to go through pretty much 10 talking points of the pros and cons of each type of heating. Alright, so the first thing to consider when you're trying to choose either from heating from above with a heat lamp or heating from below, and that is what type of snake you have. And this ball python around my neck, this is Bobby, my bamboo ball python. He pretty much hangs out on the ground the whole time, and I've actually seen quite a few people heat from above with the heat lamp with ball pythons, and I've also seen quite a few people heat from below. Pretty much in this room here, pretty much across the board for all my ball pythons, I'm heating from below with heat mats for my ball pythons. And if you have other types of snakes like green tree pythons that are arboreal species that kind of just hang out in the trees all the time, doesn't really make sense to have heat from below on a heat mat if they're not actually down on the ground on that heat. And then there's other snakes like the garter snake that's kind of, I would say, kind of in the middle, kind of hangs out on the ground, so you could potentially heat from the bottom, but garter snakes in the wild tend to bask in the sun, and they're kind of hanging out in the daytime underneath the sun, and they really appreciate some kind of light from above where they can actually bask during the day. So it really depends on what type of snake you have. Alright, so the second thing you want to keep in mind when using either the heat lamp or the heat mat, on either one of these heat sources, you definitely want to use a thermostat to control the temperature. And I've seen some really bad burns on some snakes. You know, from heat lamps, you can actually burn the top of your snake, or from a heat mat, from the belly heat, you can actually burn the belly of your snake. You definitely want to control these temperatures and put them on a thermostat so you can precisely dial in the temperatures. And I'd say it's a little bit easier with the heat mat from underneath, because essentially what you can do is you can just take the probe and you can tape it right to the heat mat, and then you have a really precise control of the heat mat. Versus if you have a lamp, I'd say it's a little bit more difficult. You actually have to have the probe pretty much under the lamp, and then you have to have the lamp on an adjustable, kind of like a dimmable thermostat, would actually dim down the lamp and get it precisely at the right temperature. The other thing you can do with the lamp is kind of what I've done with my tortoise upstairs. Is what I did is I have a really small, super tiny little heat lamp with one of those little halogen bulbs in it, and I actually put it right on the screen, figured out the distance I need for the perfect temperature for the tortoise. So I actually don't need a thermostat on there, because I put it on there and I used my temperature gun and figured out the right temperature right from the start, and it looks like without any other kind of heat control, it's at the perfect temperature on high, pretty much. You can also kind of get a dimmer for some of these, but the problem is with the dimmer is that the dimmers can kind of get bumped and can change, which can really negatively affect your whole setup if you don't have it precisely dialed in. What I'd actually suggest is if you have a dimmer, you can actually dial it in, get the right temperature, and then maybe put some tape over the little dial so someone can't actually hit that dial and accidentally adjust the temperature. Okay, so number 3, the thing that you should consider when you're using a heat lamp is that they can significantly dry out your enclosure. And I said that's pretty much one of the main cons of using a heat lamp over a heat mat, especially with ball pythons, because they need a higher humidity. I'd say it's extremely difficult to actually get a heat lamp dialed in at the right temperature and keep the humidity high enough in a ball python enclosure. I've seen some really bad sheds. As a matter of fact, when I bought some snakes, they were actually in larger enclosures with heat lamps from above, and almost every time I see a heat lamp, they struggle with stuck sheds or really bad sheds. And that's one of the disadvantages from using a lamp from above. Alright, so number 4 is actually a fix for number 3, and that is you can actually use a fogger to correct the humidity when using a heat lamp. And essentially this is the setup I have upstairs on my frog enclosure. I have a frog enclosure that actually has a little, it's one of the little tiny heat lamps with a little halogen bulb, and then that is actually set on a dimmable thermostat so I can dial in the temperature of the heat lamp. And then I have a reptifogger that is controlled by a humidity controller. So I plug it in, it monitors the humidity. I set it at about 70% humidity, and it keeps fogging into the enclosure. The problem is I kind of struggle with that setup. It works pretty good for a while, but the problem is that the lamp seems like it really drives the humidity off really fast. So it's constantly fogging and fogging and fogging. And essentially what it does is that all the fog is condensing on the bottom, and it builds up to a point where I actually have to go in there every few weeks and put a little hose in there and actually manually drain all the excess water from that setup. So I'd say it's kind of a fix. You know, for a frog it would be good, but I don't know if it would be ideal for a ball python or another snake, because you'd actually end up with a lot of condensation down in your substrate in most cases, unless you can figure out the whole workaround where you can actually fog and then maybe set the fogger maybe on a lower level or on a timer to where you don't get so much humidity down. But it's kind of one of my struggles trying to use the fogger and the heat lamp at the same time. I think it's possible maybe with a bigger enclosure. Alright, so number 5 is a disadvantage of heat lamps, and that is that they put out a significant amount of light. And the problem is if you have that heat on all the time, day and night, it can actually throw off the day-night cycle of some of your reptiles. And it really depends on your reptiles. I say for snakes it might be a little trickier, something that needs heat all the time, but I actually have a Greek tortoise upstairs, another one of my pets, and it's funny because I can actually heat them in the daytime and then turn the light off at night. He cools down quite a bit at night, but if you feed him in the morning, you definitely need the light on him. He takes a higher temperature than a lot of snakes. He gets under that lamp and gets pretty hot, and he really needs that temperature to digest his food from the morning. Alright, so number 6 is actually a fix for number 5, and that is you can actually use a ceramic heat emitter instead of a heat lamp. And the heat lamp puts out a significant portion of light, but a ceramic heat emitter essentially looks kind of like a flattened out light bulb, screws right into the light socket, and it only puts out heat with no light at all. And the problem I find with these is if your ceramic heat emitter actually burns out, you really can't tell if there's no heat unless you had some kind of like a probe with an alarm or something like that. So you really want to keep an eye on your ceramic heat emitters. They kind of freak me out using those because you don't know if it's on or not. And with a heat lamp, you can actually just look over there from across the room, and then you can see if your heat lamp is on or not. Alright, so number 7 is the ultimate fix for the last 2 talking points, and what you can actually use, you can use a radiant heat panel, and I actually just discovered this about a year ago. Essentially what it is it's a thin plastic panel that goes inside of some of your larger enclosures, and it kind of acts as almost like a heat lamp, but it doesn't have the light coming out like a heat bulb, and it doesn't have, as far as I know, I've never actually seen one burn out, where you can have the potential of the ceramic heat emitter burn out. And this is actually probably the ideal heat source for reticulated pythons. I actually have one over on my reticulated python, and it goes inside the enclosure. The enclosure is sealed pretty well, just has a little bit of ventilation, so it actually holds in quite a bit of humidity compared to, you know, like a screen top enclosure with a lamp from above. So it pretty much solves all the problem. I think that's pretty much the ideal solution. You know, the only problem is I'm not sure they come in really small packages for a really small enclosure. I think the minimum size is probably too big for like your normal enclosure for your pet snake. Alright, so number 8 is actually another solution, which is kind of the best of both worlds. You can actually use a heat lamp from above and a heat pad from below, top and bottom heat. And I actually have that on my reticulated python. I have the heat panel on the top that actually has radiant heat, and then I have a little heat on the bottom. I can actually set them to 2 different temperatures, and I prefer to set the bottom one a little bit higher. I set it to about 88 degrees, and then the top one for my retic, I set it maybe in the high 70s. I try to keep it below 80 because a lot of times reticulated pythons aren't really happy if you get the temperature above 80. If I get it up there like 78, 79 degrees, it seems like Lucy is really happy at that temperature. But the problem is it's almost a double whammy because it can really dry out the enclosure super fast if you have 2 heat sources, one from the top and one from the bottom. You have to really be creative to get that humidity into the substrate if you have a humidity loving snake. Alright, so number 9 is one of the biggest cons when it comes to heat lamps, and that is they are bulky. They take up a lot of room. As a matter of fact, most people that make these rack systems, like the racks behind me, they'll all use the heat mats and heat from the bottom. I've seen just a few instances where people are making some kind of a homemade rack with heat from above, and usually it's for reptiles like bearded dragons that really need the heat from above. But let me tell you, you actually put that heat into the rack system, and it probably takes up half the rack just in the lighting for the heat from above. So I'd say that's probably one of the disadvantages of trying to fit that heat lamp, especially if you're trying to breed a lot of reptiles and stack them up into like layers of tubs in a breeding operation. It's not really practical. I'd say if you can, you'd be better off to actually heat from the bottom. Alright, so for number 10, one of the things you want to keep in mind when you're considering using a heat lamp is that the bulbs can burn out. That's probably one of the biggest disadvantages. And not only that is especially if you're on a larger scale where you're actually breeding reptiles, it can be extremely costly to actually go through and replace some of these bulbs. I've seen some bulbs, you know, usually they're between $5 and $10 or more per bulb. And the other thing is if you don't actually have extra bulbs on hand, then you can run into some problems. I actually had this with my tortoise where the heat lamp burned out, and then I was like in a mad rush going to the pet store trying to find that unique bulb for my special lamp, and it was kind of tough because it was a really small little tiny light that was kind of unusual, I'd say. I actually picked it up at some random pet store and didn't use it for a long time, and then started using it. Didn't have any extra bulbs, and that thing burned out, and then I was kind of in a panic. So if you actually heat from above with a heat lamp, you definitely want to keep some extra bulbs on hand. Alright, so it is time for the question of the day. And Mason Pieri asks, how much did your crested geckos cost? And that is a very good question. If you actually were watching my videos at the last reptile show, I actually picked up my very first crested geckos. Pretty awesome animals. As a matter of fact, I wasn't really into crested geckos. I thought I'd never get into them until I actually went up to a table and I was like, hey, can I hold that crested gecko? And let me tell you, it was totally unexpected how soft and gentle they are and how cute they are, and they just crawl up your arm, and they're pretty amazing animals. And I actually got some pretty high-end crested geckos. I have a Super Dalmatian, which is a really sought-after morph. As a matter of fact, I've seen Super Dalmatians usually sell between $300 and $600 a piece. Pretty awesome. I'm thinking about doing some breeding. I got a pretty nice setup. As a matter of fact, I might go and show you my setup. It is really awesome. awesome. Pretty much I think I paid more for my setup than I paid for the geckos, but my Super Dalmatian was like $300, and then I had another one I bought for like $175. I'm not even sure what morph it is. I'm just kind of dabbling in crested geckos. I was thinking about getting another female, maybe another female Super Dalmatian, and then breeding some lines of the Super Dalmatian, which would be kind of cool to kind of keep that line going. Some pretty awesome animals. As a matter of fact, crested geckos they thought they were extinct in the 1800s, and all the way up until 1994 they thought they were actually extinct, and then someone found a small colony of crested geckos, and that's where all the crested geckos in the hobby came from. And I'd say they're up there, probably almost as popular as ball pythons. They're gaining popularity really fast. There's a lot of really cool morphs, and it's almost like the beginning of the ball python craze with the crested geckos. People are really getting excited about them and producing some really awesome stuff. New stuff coming out all the time. So I'm gonna go up and just show you real quick my crested geckos. Alright, so take a look at this tank. This is awesome. This is my crested gecko setup. This is the first one I've ever had. This is actually a breeder size tank, so I'm planning on breeding some. You can actually have one male and multiple females in a tank this size. Really awesome setup. This is actually an Exoterra tank, and take a look at the inside here, and this is what they look like. This is my female right here. Look at how beautiful that is. Such an amazing creature. Really awesome. And this one's actually pretty friendly, not too bad. I can actually pick them up. Look at that. I'm not even sure what morph these are. It'll be interesting to get some of your opinions on the crested geckos and see if you can tell me what morph this is. Look at that thing. So awesome. It's amazing. You don't realize how awesome they are until you pick them up, and they are really super soft, really friendly too. And a lot of times they'll actually lose their tail, and I was lucky enough to get two of them that are really awesome that actually still have their tails. And they like to jump a lot, which is pretty cool. This guy it seems like he likes to crawl a little bit more, and it's funny, he gets right on that wood and he blends right in. So that's my female. So here is the male. The male is a Super Dalmatian. Kind of interesting, the Dalmatian refers to the spots, and the Super means he has a lot of spots, and some people are saying that it actually acts like the ball python Super, where if you bred this to something else, everything would be Dalmatian. Not quite as many spots as this guy. And the funny thing about this one is he really changes color a lot. So you can tell he's kind of a peach color now. At night he turns almost completely white. Looks like a completely different crested gecko. And he's almost like a pure white with black spots. And then in the daytime when he kind of gets fired up a little bit, especially if I start handling him a little bit, he seems like he gets he kind of fires up to this interesting color of almost like a peach color. It's really kind of interesting. Alright, so there you have it. That wraps up my discussion of heat lamps versus heat mats. And I say that it really depends on what you're going for, what type of snake you have. I'd say in most cases, most people, especially with ball pythons, they end up going with a heat mat. And those were my crested geckos. Not sure how much crested gecko stuff I'm going to do on my channel, but it'd be kind of interesting once I start breeding them and having babies, just to kind of throw things in maybe at the end. I'm not sure if I want to do complete videos on crested geckos at this point. I might keep them for a little while and see how things go, see if I can actually get them to thrive and to breed. It'd be a pretty awesome project in addition to ball pythons. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.